So picture this. It's March 1940.
Right, so America isn't even in World War II yet.
Not even close. The country is actually gripped by this massive isolationist movement at the time. And yet this comic book hits the newsstands featuring a guy in, like, American flag spandex just straight up punching Adolf Hitler in the jaw.
Right on the very first cover.
Yeah, right on the cover. It was a massive, a genuinely dangerous political provocation. But it makes you wonder, how does a character born as a literal wartime propaganda poster survive for over 80 years?
It's a great question.
Right. Like, how does a symbol designed for one specific black and white global conflict stay relevant in a world of complex moral gray areas?
Well, it requires an incredible amount of narrative agility.
Yeah.
I mean, we often think of national symbols, like Mount Rushmore or the Statue of Liberty, as these permanent, static things. They're carved in stone or cast in copy.
Like, they don't change.
Exactly. But a pop culture monument like Captain America, he cannot afford to be static. If Steve Rogers hadn't fundamentally changed over the decades, he would have just been left in the 1940s.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for today's deep dive is to synthesize a massive stack of sources you've shared with us. We're pulling from historical comic retrospectives from 13th Dimension and LitHub, detailed Wikipedia character biographies, and some film-to-comic comparative analyses.
Lots of ground to cover.
Definitely. And we are going to trace exactly how Steve Rogers evolved from a two-dimensional World War II propaganda tool into, honestly, one of fiction's most complex, conflicted characters.
And whether you are a die-hard Marvel fan who knows every issue, or you're just someone fascinated by pop culture and history, this deep dive is going to show you exactly how pop culture adapts to survive changing eras.
We're basically looking under the hood of these stories.
Exactly. We'll see how writers use this character as a mirror for America's own shifting anxieties.
So we have to start right at that creation point. To understand how much he had to pivot later, you have to know that Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created Captain America a full year before the tragedy of Pearl Harbor even brought the U.S. into the war.
Which tells you everything you need to know about the creator's intent, really. Simon and Kirby were two young Jewish creators living in New York.
Right.
And they were watching the news coming out of Europe with absolute horror, while a large portion of the American public was basically saying, hey, that's not our fight.
So having their character punch the leader of Nazi Germany was a deliberate, aggressive political statement.
Oh, absolutely. And it resonated. That first issue sold 1 million copies.
Wow.
Yeah, it put its circulation right up there with major news magazines of the era.
Though, looking at the historical retrospective in our sources, there is a fun piece of trivia here. Captain America wasn't actually the first patriotic superhero on the stands.
No, he wasn't.
That title belongs to a character called The Shield, published by MLJ Comics.
And that's a vital detail, because it actually physically changed the character's design. Originally, Captain America carried a triangular shield.
Right, the heater shield shape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But MLJ Comics threatened legal action because that triangle looked suspiciously similar to the chest logo on their character, the shield.
So just to avoid a lawsuit, Simon and Kirby changed Cap's shield to the iconic, round, discuss-like weapon in issue number 2.
Yeah, a legal threat essentially created one of the most famous fictional weapons in history.
That's amazing. But, okay, let's look at what happens after the war is won. The Axis powers are defeated, the 1940s end, and superhero comics just completely crash in popularity.
Yeah, they tanked. Without a clear global villain to fight, these wartime characters lost their purpose. In the 1950s, the publishers tried to revive the character by turning him into Captain America, Commie Smasher.
Having him fight Soviet spies.
Right, but it was a total failure. The book is quickly canceled.
Why do you think audiences rejected that? Like, why didn't the transition from punching Nazis to punching Soviet spies work for the 1950s reader?
Because the national psychology had fundamentally shifted. I mean, World War II felt like a very clear battle of good versus evil. But the Cold War of the 1950s was defined by paranoia, invisible threats, and, the looming shadow of the atomic bomb.
So the vibe was just wrong.
Exactly. The earnest, bright-colored patriotism of Captain America felt completely out of step with the anxiety of the McCarthy era. People were tired of war. The audience had moved on to sci-fi, horror, and romance comics.
Which leaves the character essentially dead in the water until 1964. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are building the Marvel Universe, and in Avengers number 4, they brilliantly retcon his disappearance.
Now, for those unfamiliar, a retcon or retroactive continuity is when a writer changes or adds new information to a past event to make a news story work.
Right. So Lee and Kirby write that Steve Rogers didn't just disappear after the war. He was thrown into the freezing Atlantic Ocean in 1945 while trying to stop a drone plane, and he was preserved in a block of ice in suspended animation for decades.
And what's fascinating here is that the frozen in ice plot device wasn't just a convenient sci-fi way to bring him into the 1960s. It fundamentally altered his entire psychological makeup.
How so?
Well, he went from being a straightforward soldier to a man out of time. He wakes up in a world he barely recognizes, and he's currently burdened with severe survivor's guilt over the apparent death of his young partner, Bucky Barnes, who was on that same plane.
I am going to push back on the writer's intent there, though. Freezing him in ice feels like, I don't know, a massive cop-out.
Cop-out.
Yeah. By perfectly preserving him in a time capsule, the writers didn't have to do the hard work of letting him age naturally and adapt to the changing country. They just bypassed 20 years of history.
I see what you're saying, but bypassing that history is exactly what makes the narrative so powerful. If he had aged normally, he would have gradually compromised, slowly adapting to the complexities of the 50s and 60s like everyone else.
Okay, fair.
By freezing him, they preserved his idealized greatest generation morality in pristine condition. When you drop that completely uncompromised 1940s idealist into the rapidly growing cynicism of the 1960s Vietnam era, you create immediate explosive friction.
He becomes a walking critique of modern society.
Exactly.
Okay, I see your point. The contrast is the point. But that brilliant narrative trick of freezing Steve Rogers in 1945 accidentally created a massive glaring continuity error for the publishers.
Oh, a huge one.
Right.
Because if the real Steve Rogers was at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean from 1945 until 1964, who was the guy calling himself Captain America and fighting communists in those 1950s comic books?
Right. And for years, Marvel just swept those 1950s stories under the rug. But then in 1972, writer Steve Englehart decides he is going to face this continuity error head-on, and he solves it by introducing a tragic, terrifying character named William Burnside.
Burnside's story is just a masterclass in psychological horror. He was a superfan who attained a PhD in American history, dedicating his entire life to researching Captain America.
He was completely obsessed.
Utterly obsessed.
And he takes that obsession to an incredibly disturbing level. Burnside legally changes his own name to Steve Rogers. He gets extensive plastic surgery to physically look exactly like the original, and he eventually uncovers the lost super soldier serum in some old Nazi files in Germany.
So he and his young sidekick, Jack Monroe, inject themselves, but they miss one crucial step, which is that they didn't use the Vita rays.
Wait, pause. What on earth are Vita rays, and why does skipping them ruin everything?
Right, so Vita rays are a fictional form of radiation within the Marvel Universe.
Yeah.
In the original 1940s origin story, after Steve Rogers was injected with the serum, he had to be bombarded with Vita rays to stabilize the chemical changes in his brain and body.
Oh, so it was the catalyst that made the serum safe.
Exactly.
So Burnside and Monroe skip the stabilizing radiation, and the results are catastrophic. The flawed serum completely destabilizes their minds.
They are driven violently paranoid.
Yeah, they become reactionary, racist bigots who start attacking innocent people on the streets simply for their race or for holding differing political opinions. They become so unhinged and dangerous that the American government actually has to step in, arrest them, and put them into suspended animation just to protect the public.
And their story gets even darker years later. Burnside eventually returns to the comics as a villain known as the Grand Director.
Right.
He is captured and brainwashed by a villain named Dr. Faustus, who manipulates Burnside's corrupted patriotism and turns him into a neo-Nazi. Burnside ends up leading a violent white supremacist militia called the National Force.
And just to pause here for you listening, because we are getting into some incredibly heavy-charged, real-world political ideologies like white supremacy and neo-Nazism. Our goal today isn't to take a political stance or endorse any viewpoint.
No, not at all.
We are strictly, objectively reporting on how these comic book writers were utilizing these extreme, real-world ideologies as narrative tools to stress test the concept of Captain America. We are just looking at the mechanics of the story as presented in our sources.
And narratively speaking, Burnside serves as a crucial, dark foil to Steve Rogers. By taking the face of Captain America and grafting it onto the ideology of a neo-Nazi, the writers are forcing the reader to look at the terrifying danger of patriotism when it is stripped of basic human morality and critical thought.
He represents blind, unhinged zealotry.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you think of Steve Rogers as the idealized hardware of the American system, Burnside is like a corrupted software update.
I like that.
Right. He has the exact same physical strength. He has the same face. He's ostensibly running on the same core operating system of defending America. But what happens when that software is infected by a virus?
I want to take that analogy even further. Burnside has all the raw processing power of Steve Rogers. But because his moral coding wasn't stabilized by the Vita rays, he's entirely operating on malware.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Every action he takes is extreme because there are zero ethical firewalls in place. He shows us what happens when loyalty to a nation becomes completely detached from the actual ideals of that nation. He worships the flag, but he violently hates the people the flag is supposed to protect.
So if Burnside was the comic's way of dealing with the ghost of the 1950s Red Scare, the real Steve Rogers was about to hit a massive brick wall in the 1970s. I mean, you cannot write a character whose entire identity is wrapped up in trusting the American government during the exact moment the American public realizes the President of the United States is lying to them.
Exactly. The culture was radically shifting, the Vietnam War was dragging on, and the Watergate scandal shattered public trust in institutions. And the comic books directly reflected this cultural trauma. In 1974, writer Steve Englehart penned the Secret Empire storyline.
This storyline is wild.
It really is.
The President of the United States, who is heavily implied to be Richard Nixon, though his face is always shadowed, is revealed to be the leader of a fascist, subversive conspiracy. When Steve Rogers discovers this, he is so profoundly disillusioned by the betrayal that he completely drops the shield.
He just walks away.
Yeah, he abandons the Captain America identity entirely and creates a new persona called Nomad, the Man Without a Country.
And the visual of Captain America walking away from his own mantle was a shock to the system for readers. And this wasn't just a one-time crisis of faith either. The writers kept pushing this boundary. In 1987, Mark Gruenwald wrote the Captain America No More storyline, which explored a completely different type of government overreach.
Right, because in the 1980s, it wasn't a shadowy fascist conspiracy. It was just cold, hard bureaucracy.
That's exactly.
A government commission calls Steve Rogers into a room and tells him that the Captain America name, the costume, and the shield are all intellectual property owned by the federal government. They tell him he has to stop operating independently and work exclusively under their direct, unquestioning orders.
They basically attempt to turn a living symbol of freedom into a bureaucratic employee. And Steve looks at them, and he resigns.
He hands over the suit and the shield.
He adopts a new identity, the captain, explaining clearly that he cannot compromise his personal moral compass just to blindly obey government directives.
But I struggle with this decision from a heroic standpoint. Like, if he is Captain America, shouldn't he stay and fix the system from the inside? Doesn't dropping the shield and walking away just mean he's surrendering the symbol to the corrupt bureaucrats? It feels like quitting.
It looks like quitting, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Grunwald is making a vital philosophical distinction. Steve isn't surrendering the ideal. He is refusing to let the ideal be co-opted.
Okay, I can see that.
By walking away, he proves that true patriotism sometimes requires holding the state accountable. Refusing the government's orders was actually his most patriotic act. It was his way of defending the dream.
Because the government immediately proves his point by giving the shield to someone else. They hire John Walker, formerly known as Super Patriot, to be the new Captain America.
And Walker is the antithesis of Steve Rogers.
Completely. Where Steve represented New Deal empathy and community, John Walker represents the raw, aggressive corporate ethos of the 1980s. He is brutal, he follows orders blindly, and he is a total PR machine.
Walker is the government's ideal soldier, but he is a terrible Captain America. He lacks the fundamental empathy required to wield the shield. This era cemented the rule that Steve Rogers represents the American people and the American dream, not the American government.
And that ongoing, painful internal struggle between personal loyalty, morality, and government duty reaches an absolute boiling point in the modern era of comics and film.
It really culminates here.
The modern era is where the writers take all these philosophical debates and make them devastatingly personal.
Which brings us to 2005. Writer Ed Brubaker did something that was considered an absolute taboo in the comic book industry.
Oh, a huge taboo.
For decades, there was an unwritten rule among writers. You never bring back Uncle Ben, you never bring back Gwen Stacy, and you never bring back Bucky Barnes. Bucky's death in World War II was the tragic anchor of Steve's entire modern existence.
But Brubaker brings him back anyway. He reveals that Bucky didn't actually die in that plane explosion in 1945. Instead, his body was recovered by Soviet forces.
Right.
He was brainwashed, given a cybernetic arm, and turned into the Winter Soldier, this legendary ghost-like assassin who was kept cryogenically frozen between missions so he barely aged.
And Brubaker leaned heavily into Cold War spy fiction to make this work. He grounded Captain America in the murky, morally gray world of modern espionage. But the genius of the story is the emotional toll it takes on Steve.
Yeah, he isn't fighting a monster. He is fighting his best friend who has been tortured into becoming a weapon.
Exactly.
Now, to fix Bucky's broken mind, Sneer eventually has to use something called a cosmic cube. Now, hold on. You can't just drop reality-warping cosmic cube into this grounded espionage story. What exactly is that, and why did Brubaker need something that extreme to resolve the plot?
It is a jarring shift in tone, isn't it? In Marvel lore, a cosmic cube is literally a glowing box containing immense, godlike energy that allows the user to alter the fabric of reality itself.
Okay, so magic space box.
Basically. But Brubaker uses this fantastical cosmic object for a deeply intimate psychological purpose. Steve doesn't use the cube to rewrite history or unkill anyone. He simply uses it to force Bucky's repressed original memories to break through the Soviet brainwashing.
Which is almost crueler than fighting him if you think about it. By restoring his memory, Steve forces his best friend to suddenly remember decades of assassinations he committed against his will. The emotional weight of that choice is staggering.
It's heartbreaking.
And right on the heels of that emotional devastation, in 2006, writer Mark Millar drops the Civil War comic event.
And the comic version of Civil War was a massive, sprawling allegory for the Patriot Act and the post-9/11 debates over security versus freedom. The U.S. government attempts to pass the Superhero Registration Act, a law that would force all masked heroes to reveal their secret identities to the government and act as a federally regulated police force.
And naturally, based on everything he learned in the 70s and 80s, Steve Rogers completely rejects this.
He has to.
He refuses to hand over a registry of vulnerable people to the government. He goes underground to lead a resistance, while Iron Man leads the pro-registration side, believing oversight is necessary to prevent catastrophes.
This raises an important question. How do you possibly adapt a storyline that's sprawling, featuring dozens of subplots and hundreds of characters, into a 2.5-hour film?
You really can't.
No. When the Russo brothers directed the 2016 film adaptation, Captain America: Civil War, they had to make some drastic, brilliant changes to the source material.
For starters, they had to completely scrap the secret identity debate. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there are no secret identities. Tony Stark announced he was Iron Man on live television.
Right. Everyone knows who they are.
So instead of a registration act, the filmmakers introduced the Sokovia Accords. What exactly were the Accords in the context of the movie?
The Sokovia Accords were a set of legal documents designed by the United Nations. They mandated that the Avengers would no longer be a private organization. They would operate exclusively under the supervision of a UN panel, only deploying when and where the panel deemed it necessary.
It's the 1987 Captain America No More storyline all over again, but on a global scale.
Exactly.
And the Russo brothers totally reinvented the villain to make this conflict work on screen. In the comics, the villain pulling the strings is Baron Helmut Zemo, who is your classic mustache-twirling comic bad guy. He wears a purple hood and leads a team of supervillains called the Masters of Evil.
But a guy in a purple hood leading the Masters of Evil doesn't really fit the grounded political thriller tone the Russos were building, so they stripped all of that away. The cinematic Zemo isn't a baron or a supervillain. He's just an anonymous, grieving Sokovian intelligence officer.
His entire family was killed as collateral damage during a previous Avengers battle.
Right. He has no interest in world domination. He knows he can't beat the Avengers in a fistfight, so his entire plan is to quietly manipulate them into destroying each other from the inside, using the Sokovia Accords and Bucky Barnes as the wedge to drive them apart.
It is a brilliant pivot. It takes a massive geopolitical concept and grounds it in raw human grief. And despite the film doing all this heavy lifting, it also successfully introduces two monumental characters to the cinematic universe. We get the introduction of Black Panther, who originally debuted way back in Fantastic Four number 52 in 1966, and Spider-Man, who first appeared in Amazing Fantasy number 15 in 1962.
Which proves just how different these two storytelling mediums are. Comic book events have to involve the entire fictional universe to sell books across 50 different monthly titles. But movies require a central, beating emotional anchor.
Yeah, if the comic book version of Civil War is an actual sprawling geopolitical battlefield, the film version is much more like, I don't know, a really painful family Thanksgiving dinner.
Oh, I love that. Let's follow that thought. How is this superhero clash a Thanksgiving dinner?
Think about it. You are trapped in a room with people you genuinely love and respect, but you are fighting over deeply held, irreconcilable beliefs. The arguments are deeply personal, past grievances are brought to the surface, and nobody wants to be the one throwing the punches.
That's so true.
By the end of the dinner, the house is trashed and the family is completely fractured. It is a tragedy of miscommunication and stubbornness.
And that intimate tragedy is exactly why the film resonates so deeply with audiences. The Russo brothers took the abstract, intellectual debate about government oversight and distilled it down to one agonizing question. Will Steve Rogers abandon his traumatized best friend to comply with international law?
And the answer, of course, is no.
Always no.
So what does this all mean? We have traveled from a guy punching Hitler on a page in 1940 all the way to a global cinematic debate about international law and personal loyalty. I think the ultimate takeaway for you listening right now is that Captain America has endured for over 80 years, specifically because he is not a simple static propaganda tool.
Exactly. From his anti-Nazi origins to facing the dark reflection of William Burnside's fanaticism, through his multiple resignations in the face of government overreach in the 70s and 80s, all the way to the emotional devastation of the Winter Soldier. Steve Rogers is defined by his struggle.
Yeah.
He is a character defined by the constant agonizing effort required to actually live up to an ideal in a world that constantly demands compromise.
His journey mirrors society's own ongoing, often deeply painful struggles with what it actually means to be patriotic. It is never as simple as just waving a flag. Which brings us right back to where we started today. We talked about how physical monuments are carved in stone, but Captain America is a living mirror.
He really is.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own. If Captain America's shield was originally created to protect us from the Axis powers of the 1940s, and it later evolved to protect us from the dangers of our own government's corruption in the 1970s and 80s, what exactly